All right. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon, good morning, or good night. Welcome to our meetup today. I'm here with Javier. Hello, Javier. You need to unmute yourself.
Of course, I have to. Sorry about that. Hi, Kayo. Hi, everyone. How are you?
Uh, I guess that we're live. I'm listening to myself right now. So I would like to welcome everybody today for our Reactor meetup. This is we're speaking from Latin America. I'm live from the Reactor São Paulo, and Javier he's live from Argentina. Did I pronounce right? Argentina.
Argentina. Yeah.
Argentina. So I hope that you are healthy, well, and safe. This is a really strange time. So, but thankfully, thanks to the internet, we can go live here through the YouTube. My name is Caio Calado. I am the local PM for the Reactor São Paulo. I am the local responsible for the activities down here in São Paulo. For those who doesn't know, Reactor is a global community that we have in 10 different countries, 14 different locations, and there is a reactor for everyone, and we can host many activities from different places and to having different speakers and MVPs and community members to be here sharing with the community too. So if you're watching us from a different place other than, I don't know, Sao Paulo, maybe you're in North America or in Canada, maybe there is a reactor next to you. So if you like to join our reactor community, just look for the meetup reactor, and then you're going to find many different locations. Before we start, we always show our code of conduct. Basically, it's just like common sense, being respectful, promote like good things, keep the vibe like really good. And in every Reactor event, we try to provide like a respectful, friendly, and professional experience for everyone, regardless the gender, sexual orientation, physical appearance, disability, age, race, or religion. So we try to be friendly to everybody, and we ask the community to help us to keep things, I don't know, the good vibes, I guess. If you, I don't know, one day you think that we fail on this, if you would like to report any suspicious activities or inappropriate comments, you can go to the microsoftreactor.com. Over there, you're going to be able to find our code of conduct again, and there is a form over there that you can report any suspicious activities. So for today, I just have two guidelines. If you have any questions or comments that you would like to share, please do it at any time. Me and Javier, we're going to be able to review those, and in the end, we're going to have a Q&A sessions. So I'm not a developer per se, so I ask you to help me with that. So please share your questions at any time, and we're going to have the Q&A in the end. The last thing that I would like to say is to be careful. Don't share any sensitive or personal information that you don't want to be here on this event. This is a live recorded session, so it's recording live. So help us to not share anything that you don't want to have it here. So for today, our agenda is basically two things. We're going to have the presentation and then the Q&A session. The presentation is about introduction to Azure SQL. Javier, your slides is on the screen right now. And I'm going to be back for the Q&A session. Okay.
All right.
Have fun.
Very good. Thank you. All right, everyone. Let's talk about two great things that I do use and I do love a lot: Azure and SQL, right? And together they are the Azure SQL Family, right? Which is a group of products and services that we will try to dive into today in this presentation, and know a little bit more about what is this Azure SQL thing, what are the different components, and maybe, get some ideas on how we can start using this technology in the cloud for our next big project. All right, so let's move on. A little bit about myself. My name is Javier Villegas. I am from Buenos Aires, Argentina. I work as a global database administrator and design coordinator at Mediterranean Shipping Company. I've been involved with SQL Server and the whole data platform portfolio for over 20, 25 years now. My specialty is high availability, disaster recovery, performance tuning, right? So all those fun stuff. I am a Microsoft MVP in the data platform category, as well as a Microsoft certified trainer. And in my free time, I like to do these kind of things, share technical presentations to the different communities. So I've been part of several events as a speaker. I'm part of the PASS community, Professional Association of SQL Server, and member of the local community here in Argentina, right? SQL Argentina. In the left side of the screen, you have all my contact information, email address, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Please contact me. I love to share and be in touch with you guys and discuss anything related to this presentation or anything that you would like to discuss. All right. So, what is Azure SQL? First of all, we all know what SQL Server is, right? It's the relational database engine that we've been using on-premise for many years, right? Recently, in SQL Server 2017, we had the great pleasure to have it running not only in Windows platform, as we've been doing it for decades, but now also in Linux platform, right? So SQL Server, the on-prem version, runs on Windows and the major distribution of Linux. But this is not Azure SQL, right? This is still SQL on-prem. So when we move to Azure, when we move our infrastructure, our technology, our data center up to the cloud, we have SQL Server, but on a different, let's say, flavor. Let's see what this is about. The first differentiation we have to do is what Microsoft called infrastructure as a service and then platform as a service, right? This is the first division that we need to choose one or the other depending on our needs. So if, let's say, we took the decision to move our infrastructure to our databases, let's say, to Azure, we have to choose. The first option is infrastructure as a service. What is this? It's a virtual machine running SQL Server, right? A virtual machine in Azure that is running the same version that we've been running on-premise, right? So we will check later how we can create this VM, the different settings, characteristics, etc. But just consider that if you have the necessity of grabbing your database and move them quickly to Azure, you're going to have the same thing that you have today, but running on a virtual machine in Azure. And when I say the same, is 100% the same. But also, you have to take care about the same things that you are taking care of today. For example, you have to make sure that the patches are applied, and this is your responsibility for the operating system and also for SQL. Also, if you have let's say, high availability and disaster recovery, you have to set up an additional virtual machine on another Azure region, configure the availability group with always on, synchronous, asynchronous. Then if you have to take backups, you have to take care of yourself, right? So it's exactly the same thing that you have today, but in Azure. If you need to administer this environment, if you need, to use your monitoring tool, do any kind of development, Visual Studio or any other application, is exactly the same. And the way to migrate there, we're gonna see it in deep later, but it's as simple as doing a backup and a restore, right? Because again, it's the same SQL Server version that we run on-prem, but in a virtual machine. This is infrastructure as a service. So then let's say that, okay, this is good. This is a good option to have quick visibility in Azure, but now I would like to have something else. I would like to take advantage of these cloud services and start using SQL Server as a service. And what is that? Okay, Microsoft is gonna give us just a SQL endpoint, right, in where we will connect with our tool to do development, administration, etc., and we will only care about that, the application and the business. All the other things that I mentioned earlier, backup, high availability, disaster recovery, and all those kind of infrastructure things are already taken care of by Microsoft as part of the service, right? So we don't care about which OS we have underneath, neither applying the patches or setting up availability group or disaster recovery, or even taking backups, because all this is being taken care of by the service itself. So this is what Microsoft call platform as a service, right? So they give us the SQL platform and we do our business. So you will see that there are two different, I will say, flavors of Azure SQL, right? The first one, which is the one that is at the right side of the screen, is Azure SQL Database. If you remember when Microsoft introduced Azure back in 2010, SQL Azure, or I mean, they were changing the name multiple times in all since 2010, right? But this component was in the middle of the infrastructure, right? They were so they have this Azure SQL Database since day one, right? Again, of course, it is much better, much more advantage that we have today than what it used to be, name changes, etc. But this is what Azure SQL Database is. It's a SQL Server endpoint, right, for us to connect with Management Studio, Azure Data Studio, Visual Studio, or any other application, and just deploy our application over there, right? Over the presentation, we're gonna see which are the characteristics of this particular service, because it's not our regular SQL Server, right? The main difference between this and what we know, right, is that everything has to live within one user database. Why is that? This is designed for modern applications, right, in where all lives within one single user database. So, for example, let's say that today you have one application which has a store procedure, and that store procedure is doing a join between tables that are on different user databases, right? We know that we can do that with SQL Server with no problem. In Azure SQL Database, that is not possible, right? Because again, everything lives within one user database. We can have tables, views, store procedures, functions, same as we know, right? But we cannot go outside our Azure SQL database, right? We will see that there are techniques or tools or solutions to migrate what we have on-prem to this Azure SQL database, right? But again, this was good. This is proven. This works very well. But there was something missing, right? So let's say that I would like to take advantage of a platform as a service offering, but in terms of my application, let's say that is a legacy application which involves several databases, and I would like to make it as similar to what we have today, but again, as a platform as a service option. Microsoft released 2 years ago another option, which is Azure SQL Database Managed Instance. This is, again, a platform as a service offering, but we have almost 100% compatibility with what we have in SQL Server on-premise, right? So we can have as many databases as we want. We have almost the same functionality that we have in SQL, including, all the components that we know and we need. For example, SQL Server Agent or SQL Server Database Mail, or service broker, replication. So everything that we need in SQL is in Azure SQL Database Managed Instance, right? So the migration is as simple as just taking a backup of our databases on-prem, right? Let's say that we have a SQL Server 2008. We just take a backup of those databases and we restore it in a managed instance. It's that simple, right? And right away, we have our database running in a platform as a service option, right? So let's see a little bit more what this is all about. So SQL Server virtual machines, right? We will see that from the Azure Portal, there are several images that we can choose with a combination of different OS, again, Windows and Linux, and also different combination of SQL Server versions and editions, right? So we will go through that in a bit. Again, going to the right, in the database world, Azure SQL Database, right? We have this single database, right? And then we have this called Elastic Pool. Each of these Azure SQL Database has its own, let's say, assignment of resources, right? And we're going to go through that in a bit. So Azure SQL Database is not like a single database, right? I mean, our application, of course, has to live within the database, but we can have multiple ones, right? Again, they cannot talk, they cannot interact one of each other, right? But we can have more than one, right? And this Elastic Pool gives us the possibility of having a set of resources in terms of memory, CPU, etc., and grant those resources to each of the databases in a dynamic way, depending on the workload, depending on a schedule. Let's say my application is the backend of an e-commerce solution, and for Thanksgiving or for Christmas, we know that the activity is going to be higher than the average, right? So then, in that particular case, we can grant dynamically more resources so we can handle the extra workload. And then for the managed instance offering, right, we have this single instance. We're going to check in a little bit. And then we have this instance pool, which is kind of a similar, right? We have a set of resources that we can grant dynamically to the managed instance. So this is a summary, right, of what we can do with all this offering, right? Again, the Azure SQL family is Azure SQL SQL Server running on a virtual machine, Azure SQL Database, and Azure SQL Database Managed Instance. So when, let's say that we are already in the moment in where we have to decide which of these three options is the best for us, right? To migrate our existing application or to start a brand new deployment, right? So when we need to put in our consideration, we have all these points to consider. If we're talking about business continuity, high availability, automated backup, long-term backup retention, or sheer replication, right? Those are just some of the things that are included in Azure SQL, right? We mentioned a few times earlier that high availability and disaster recovery is built in the platform as a service offering, right? We don't have to create availability groups, the cluster, endpoints to do, replication, nothing, right? High availability is part of the thing. Backups, we don't need to take care of backups, right? So we can just configure for how long we would like to have it, the retention of the backups, and underneath the service will take care by itself, right? Sheer replication, if we like to have additional SLA in our application, for example, and we would like to replicate our Azure SQL database from one region to the other, it's just as simple as just clicking, doing a couple of clicks on the Azure Portal. Something also important to consider is that if we need, let's say, in the on-premise world today, let's say that you have your SQL Server running on your server, right? And let's say that for any reason you need to scale, right? Assigning more memory, more CPU, faster disk, expand the disk, etc., etc. We know that is quite complex in the on-prem world, right? Because we have to contact the vendor, check if there are additional sockets to put an additional CPU, and see if we can put more memory, and see if the storage allow faster this, etc., etc. And that is costly and takes time. In the Azure SQL world, doing a scale up is just as simple as moving one slider in the Azure Portal, right? It's very simple. And, we have this option of granting or assigning resources temporarily where we have additional work, right? Advanced security. There are mechanisms working within Azure SQL Database that if there is any security anomaly that is detected, right, it's going to notify us right away. This is versionless. Azure SQL Database is versionless. What does it mean? It's not like, SQL 2016, 17, or 19. It's Azure SQL. That's it, right? So we don't care about the version, and it's, always evolving in the same version. Monitoring. We will see that from the Azure Portal, we have a ton of metrics to collect and use, right? So this is the new way how we're going to be monitoring our databases. Built-in intelligence. This service allows us to tune the SQL workload on the fly, even with the option of creating and dropping indexes that the engine consider that are necessary to improve the performance. So it's definitely something to pay attention. All the benefit that we can have using a platform as a service offering. So if we need to purchase hardware, right? Now we don't need to worry about that. Protect our backups, right? But for the backups, there are these rules that we need to take the backup outside of our data center. I have 2 copies on different places. All that it's being taken care by the service. High availability, disaster recovery, monitoring, and performance tuning is all built in as part of the offering. Right? So when we go deeper and say, okay, now I'd like to move to Azure SQL, and let's say just doing a small pause here, my recommendation is the initial step should be going to an Azure virtual machine running the same SQL Server version that you have, or maybe a newer one, right? And that should be the first step, right? So that will allow us to move us to Azure quickly. But then you will see that these 2 options, Azure SQL Database and Managed Instance, are definitely the final target of our deployment, right? So when we need to do the migration, how do we start? I told you before that for the virtual machines and for Azure SQL Database Managed Instance, is as simple as a backup restore. But let's say that our business requires us to do the migration online. What is a migration online? We cannot shut down the business for 2, 3, 6 hours, 1 day, while we take the backup, move the backups to Azure, and we restore it there, and we configure everything. It has to be with near zero downtime, right? Well, Microsoft gave us these tools and services to do the migration. Let's see what they are. Data Migration Assistant is a tool that you download and install in your local computer, and basically allows you to assess your source, what you are migrating from, choose a destination, right? Any of the destination that I mentioned before, and it's going to do an evaluation if there is anything that we need to adjust, refactor, re-architect, or change, right? So I told you earlier that if the destination is an Azure SQL database, well, most probably we're going to need to rewrite multiple parts if our application requires or involves multiple user databases, right? But again, all this assessment will go through and will give us a report. And if there is something that we need to, let's say, adjust, change, modify, it's going to provide us with all the technical information and the links to go there and give us, it's not going to fix it by ourselves, but at least it's going to tell us how to fix it, right? So then we will go, fix the code if it is necessary, rerun this assessment, right? And, let's say that the end result will be like a clean message. If it is clean, then we are good to go, right? And then we can switch to this service, Azure Database Migration Service, which will give us the possibility of having these 2 types of migration, offline or online. If we choose online, because as I said, our business requires us to be online as much as possible, right? Internally, it will take care of just moving the different components in an online way, right? And when it's all moved with different techniques, right? SQL replication, log shipping, etc. When everything is moved, the only thing that we have to do is just change the connection string for our application, right? It's that simple. So, doing kind of a quick summary in terms of deployment options, right? We have in the Azure Marketplace, we have this pre-image, these pre-installed images ready to use, right? So in where we have SQL Server already installed. For virtual machines, recently, Microsoft has introduced what they call resource provider. And what is that? It's basically a component that allow us to, let's say, give some platform as a service like features to a virtual machine. And why is that? We can tell this resource provider to take care of doing the backups, right? So we don't take care about the backups anymore. From the portal, we just configure the backups. Also, if we would like to apply the patches, right, we don't need to do it ourselves, right? From the portal, we can say, hey, I give you this maintenance window from, let's say, 2 a.m. to 3 a.m., and you take care of applying the patches, right? So this way is like removing some of the responsibilities that we have today in the on-prem world, right? Because, you know, patches and backups are things that we need to take care of manually, right? But now through the portal. In terms of sizing, right? These virtual machines, we will see it in the demo in a minute, is quite easy to do any kind of scale, right? So let's say that initially we come up with the virtual machine with 4 beakers, half a terabyte, and 3 disks, right? Let's say that if after a little while we notice that we require more processing power or more memory or disk, it's simple as just go to the portal and change the settings, right? We won't lose anything. It's going to just redeploy, and it's going to come up with more CPU, memory, and disk right away. So this is something definitely quite important. In terms of networking and security, right, there are some features that allow us to integrate deeply with other Azure services. And as I mentioned multiple times, the whole HADR security, HADR options are kind of built in, right? I mean, for virtual machines, we need to do it manually, as we know, but we have availability groups, we have everything we know. And recently, they introduced the possibility of having shared storage failover cluster. What is this? Active, passive node sharing a disk, right? So one of them is active, and if something happened with that, let's say we have to shut it down or it crashed or whatever, right away it does a failover, and in a matter of few seconds, the service keeps up and running on the other node. Something extremely useful, right? That I've been using a lot in the on-premise world. So for managed instance, right, is these are the key features, right? All the ones that we been mentioning right now is just SQL Server as a service, right? And if we have to, remember that I mentioned that it's not 100% compatible with SQL Server on-premise, right? There are just few things just for you to consider. If your application requires these features called file stream or file table, right? They are not supported in Azure SQL Database Managed Instance. So in that case, that will require you to modify your application to use any other possibility, like, for example, storing the files in Azure Blob Storage or something like that, right? So that is one of the most critical or most important difference between managed instance and SQL on-prem. Also, if you use distribute transactions, right, you use the MSDTC, distribute transaction coordinator, let's say, to open a transaction here and go to other server, capture the data and insert it into a local table. Well, that's still not 100% ready. We're going to go through that in a minute. In terms of Azure SQL Database, this is, I didn't mention this one too much. I just mentioned at the beginning that, it's one of the first services, and I just said, no, everything has to run in one single user database, right? So my advice is that if you are building a brand new application, a modern application, which require some sort of SQL engine as a backend, right? Take a look of Azure SQL Database as the first option, right? Again, everything has to run on this only one user database, but if you are designing, right, you can do it from day one, right? If you are moving, let's say, a legacy application that involves, SQL replication, multiple databases, et cetera, well, managed instance is going to be your option. So those are my recommendations. So here we have in this slide, so how do we choose, right, between one or the other, right? And this is what I just mentioned before, right? We will go through the portal in a minute to see how we provision and how we set up one of these and how they look like when we have to work with them from Management Studio, Azure Data Studio, or any other tool. So let's say that now is the time to decide, okay, now I'm going to move to a managed instance. What's next? The first thing we have to choose basically is the service tier, right? What is the service tier? It's like in which bucket of resources it's gonna be. So we have, for managed instance, two tiers. The first one is general purpose. According to Microsoft, most of the workloads that are in the market, this tier should be able to handle it properly. Then there is an additional tier called business critical, in where the main difference is that the disk IOPS and latency are much lower than general purpose. And there is also an additional read-only replica in case we would like to offload our read-only workload, right? So we have these two tiers. This is, let's say, is as a big picture, right? Then the other thing we have to choose, or what we have actually, is the vCore model. Right? We have to choose the amount of vCores that our managed instance will have. And this is similar to the amount of core that our server will have. It's not exactly the same, but this is how we can think about it. So then we have the cost, right? Of course, business critical is more expensive. They said like 2.5 times more because again, because of the latency on the disk and this additional replica, right? So now if we go to Azure SQL Database, right, the initial model was called DTU, Database Transaction Unit. This is how the service was born, right? But recently, Microsoft is moving to a vCore model, same as for managed instance. So they're trying to stay away of the old DTU model and just switch to the vCore model. And under the vCore model, again, there is the general purpose, right? The business critical, and there is an additional tier called hyperscale, right? This hyperscale allows us to host that big databases, like, for example, 100 terabyte database, right? With hyperscale, with this option, right, we're going to be able to host it and do any sort of operations, right? In terms of hardware, we will see that they call it Gen 5, right? So and a few months ago, we used to have also Gen 4, right? Now it's only Gen 5, and they are looking forward to introduce the future of the hardware generation that will run this. This is how this looks like through the portal. So and with the application that we all use. So we should stop here for a second in this summary, and let's actually see it in action a little bit so we can understand a little bit more what we have seen so far. So let me jump to the portal. I will go to here, to the Azure portal. Where is it? Let me close and reopen. Caio, you tell me if we are good with the time, if there are questions or anything. You stop me anytime. And
No, so far so good. You just need to share your screen again.
I do?
Yeah, I guess it's not here anymore.
Okay.
It's there, right?
It is here. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not here.
Let me go back.
Yep. Thank you.
Okay, good. So I will go to the Azure portal. Right? I have to log in. And then once I am here, I have this component up here called Azure SQL, right? So when we go to Azure SQL, here I have all the Azure SQL resources that I already have deployed, but I'm gonna go up here to the Add option, right? So when I go here, then we will see something a little bit more familiar to what we have seen already. We have the Azure SQL Database, right? Single server, single database, elastic pool, etc. Managed instance, and then we have the virtual machine, right? All the three components that we mentioned already. When I go here under image, right? See here, we have a bunch of combination of operating system, right? Up here is Windows 2019. Down here is Red Hat Linux, Ubuntu, running SQL Server 2019 Enterprise or Standard, SUSE Linux, right? SQL Server 2017, right? And we go down and we can even go to SQL Server 2008 R2 running on Windows Server 2008 R2, right? So if we choose one of these, it's going to come up with a VM running this OS with this SQL Server version and edition. So we have, bunch of options. Let's go to the first one. Let's deploy a virtual machine running Windows Server and SQL Server 2019. When we go here to create, as every resource, we have to specify the Azure subscription, the resource group, then we have to specify a machine name, the Azure region in where we're going to deploy this, right? The image, as we mentioned before, and then we have here the size, right? And when we go to the size, we go here to see all sizes, right? And here is where we're going to have all the combinations of VM families, right? For example, we have the one that they call general purpose, the amount of virtual CPU, memory, the amount of disk, the maximum available IOPS, the storage for 10 dB, for example, and the type of disk, and here the cost. The cost is in Argentinian pesos, so that is why the numbers are quite big. So if we go down, we will see that there are memory optimized VMs, right, with more CPU, more memory, additional disk, general purpose, right? So, and then we have, if we go down, We have monsters VMs, for example, the one in the M family. Down here, right, we have 208 CPU, almost 3 terabytes of RAM. Here we have almost 6 terabytes of RAM, right? So we have an option if we want to run a heavy workload, right? So we choose one, right? Then we have to specify a username and password, and then we move on, right? And the end result is going to be a virtual machine running SQL. I will show you the one that I have already deployed in a minute, right? So let's go back to Azure SQL. Again, let's add, and let's go to the Manage Instance option, right? So when we go here to Manage Instance, right, this is kind of similar, right? We are not deploying a VM, we are deploying a managed instance, right? But you see the experience is quite similar. So we have to choose our subscription, the resource group, specify a managed instance name. It has to be lowercase, MI reactor. Then in which zone we're going to deploy it. And here is, when we have to choose compute and storage, right? So the default is general purpose, blah, blah, blah. So we will go here and hit configure, right? So under here, we have the two options, general purpose, business critical. Right now, the only hardware generation is Gen 5. We can specify the amount of B cores that we would like to have in our managed instance. Again, eventually, if we need more, we come here and we create it, and we just go here and move the slider, and we're going to have more CPU. Same for the storage, right? If you have already an agreement with Microsoft for the licenses, right, you can just go here and say, hey, I already have the agreement, and that will reduce the cost. Then here we can choose about the how we're going to have the redundancy for the backups, etc. So let's choose. And then if we want to do business critical, it's kind of similar, right? So let's go to general purpose. Let's choose 4 cores, this amount of storage. We hit apply. So we have to specify a username, SA reactor, specify a password and repeat it. And then we move on, right? We specify the networking part. Not much to do. Here, something important that was not in the initial version of managed instance. Now we can choose the collation, right, that we're going to be using in our managed instance. Before it was only the default. And also we can choose the time zone, right? The initial version was only for the UTC, right? So we didn't have the possibility of setting up the time zone, and we have to handle it through the application. If eventually we need the failover, we need to use another zone, and we have another managed instance, we can just choose it here, and we're gonna, automatically it will synchronize from my East US zone to the zone that we choose to do the high availability. Now we're gonna skip it. Tags, etc. So then here we have the review. We have a summary of how much it's going to cost, plus minus, right? The whole summary. Something extremely important also, see down here, we have the possibility of downloading a template for automation. So let's see that, let's assume that you have to deploy 100 VMs or 5 or 6 managed instances, right? So instead of going through the portal and doing them one by one, you just do one, you download the template here, and then within the portal or with PowerShell or any other simple tool, the CLI, for example, you can automate and create many more, much faster, right? So when we are ready here, right, we just hit the create button. Something interesting in the managed instance world is that it's a kind of long-running process to create the managed instance. It's telling you that it can take up to 6 hours, right? Funny history is that initially in the private previews, this used to be up to 40, 50 hours, right? Now it's much, much faster. It's still 6 hours. And the thing is that consider that internally it has to deploy multiple instances. It has to set up the whole, HADR and provide you the endpoints, etc., etc. That is why it's taking, this amount of time. So we won't create it today. We don't have 6 hours, but let's go back here to Azure SQL, and I will show you what I already have deployed. Here I have a virtual machine. Right? Here is my virtual machine. Here I have a managed instance, right? And here I have an Azure SQL database. So I have the 3 components, right? So a virtual machine, I won't show it to you. Is you just do remote desktop, and you will notice that it's the same SQL Server that you always use. But if we go to managed instance, right? See here that up here you have all the connectivity information. Down here you see all the databases that you have. When was the last, backup? You see a CPU utilization history over time, right? So from the portal, you see the amount of resources that you are consuming. You can specify security from here, just enabling or disabling different firewall rules, etc., right? Eventually, if you need to resize the managed instance, you come to the very same page and you say, hey, I need additional storage, and maybe I need 4 more cores, right? So when you do that, it's going to tell you how much it's going to cost, etc., right? And you do apply. And when you do apply, the managed instance will resize automatically, right? And we'll have the new configuration. And that is the same for virtual machines, right? And database. Let's go for a minute to a virtual machine, right? In the virtual machine world, we see, in this moment, my VM is stopped. So that is why it's shut it down. So that is why I don't see it running here, and I don't see much actually, right? But if I go to the Azure SQL Database, again, I see the whole CPU history in terms of, disk usage, latency, etc., etc. I can configure shear replication. If I have more than one, I can say, hey, I have my database deployed in East US. I want to copy here in another location, and automatically it will create a new one for me, right? So we have all the built-in auditing, monitoring, troubleshooting, everything from here, right? And then let's say this is nice. You're telling me how you can deploy everything through the Azure Portal, right? So now I would like to see how I can connect to this. And to do that, I have Management Studio, right? With Management Studio, here I am connected. Oh, here I am connected to my all the offerings I have, right? This one, the one at the top is the managed instance. Here is SQL Server 2019 running in a virtual machine. And this one is an Azure SQL database, right? Notice something important, that each one has its own icon, right? So from here, we can easily notice in which one we are connected, right? So if we go to the SQL Server, the normal SQL Server, this is a SQL Server. We have the SQL Serveration. Right now, this is top. We see the shops, security, availability groups, etc. If we go to Azure SQL Database, right, you see here we don't see the SQL Serveration, right? And the only thing we only see is the database, right? Under here, we have tables, views, store procedures, same as we know, right? And then if we go to the top to manage instance, right, we will see something more similar to the regular SQL Server, right? Multiple databases, security, the SQL Serveration, the SQL shops, replication, etc., right? I'm connected here as any other database from Management Studio. Eventually, if you would like to use Azure Data Studio, right? Again, I'm here connected with Azure Data Studio to both my managed instance and my Azure SQL database. So from here, I just need to expand, and then I work with T-SQL as I normally do, right? Creating tables, views, store procedures, everything, right? So this is a little bit how we interact outside the portal, right, with Azure SQL. So let's go back to the presentation for a minute, just to cover few other things. In terms of the SQL Server version, right, there are three pillars for the whole Azure SQL family,
Javier?
right? Yeah.
You need to change the slides.
Oh, you're right. Sorry. So one of the major pillars is security, right? So in terms of security, all the features that we know from SQL with encryption from the client, including the connection string and the data within the database, right, is encrypted, right? So we have features like SQL auditing, transparent data encryption, always encrypted, right? Same as what we know from SQL Server. In terms of migration, as we said, we have the possibility of just doing a simple migration for some cases, right? For VMs and for managed instance, in where we just take the backup, we store it in a blob storage, and we just restore it on the destination, right? And it just simple work. In terms of performance, right? All the mentioned performance features that SQL Server has are there. For example, accelerated database recovery, intelligent query processing, etc. Everything is the same as in the regular SQL Server. So indexing capabilities, in-memory OLTP, everything is in there, right? So it's just SQL. That's the what I'm trying to say, right? So it's the same SQL that we all use and love. In terms of performance, there are just some things that we have to be aware of, right? For example, TempDB, we have to allocate it on a specific drive, for example, for virtual machines. And so there are some capabilities that we have to adjust. And maybe if we are, moving our DBA and developer skill, we may need to adjust, not much, right? Because again, this is just SQL, right? So in terms of management, dynamic management views and functions, they are all there. Extended events in the 3 tiers. We're gonna find everything we know, right? So just moving forward to show you the few more that I want to go through. And okay, and one of the most important things that we have within the Azure SQL family is that it can easily integrate with the other Azure data platform components, right? Machine learning, Azure Data Factory to do, ETLs, Azure Function, cognitive services to enrich our data, IoT to handle streaming data, analysis services, Power BI, right? So it can easily integrate with all the Azure Data Platform components, right? To manage Azure SQL Database or manage instance, we have this new application called Azure Data Studio. I just showed it to you a minute ago, right? It's the modern experience to connect to SQL. The big difference with Management Studio is that it's multi-platform, right? It runs in Linux and Mac and Windows. And here are some of the latest updates in the Azure SQL family that were released during Ignite last week, right? So all the improvement that I will leave it available in the slide for you to check it, right? And here are some resources for you if you want to learn more, right? Microsoft Learn site is the source of learning and documentation for getting started with this. There are several videos from Anna Hoffman and I forgot, from Anna and the whole data platform team, just telling you how to start with this and how to start, let's say, deploying your Azure SQL experience in there, right? You can set up virtual environment for free and start playing around and get some knowledge in Azure SQL Database. And with that, I just finished the presentation. If there is any questions.
We do have some questions, and I'm not sure if it's the same person or if it was just a coincidence. We have two João Paulos asking, and I guess they are different people. But so the very first question is from João Rodrigues. He asked about what's the best option to migrate my own premises SQL jobs to Azure SQL.
The SQL shops, if you have, let's say, if your application requires something for you to run shops on a scheduled basis, right? So let's say once a day, once every hour, or every Saturday, you can do it with all the options you have, right? In the SQL Server, you can use SQL Server agent, same as managed instance. In Azure SQL Database, right, you don't have the SQL Server agent, but there are other options within Azure which will allow you to run your scheduled task and use your Azure SQL Database as a source. Let's say you have to do update statistic, or you need to run a report every day at midnight. Well, there are options within the Azure Portal to do this, right? It's not as straightforward, maybe, or it's not the way that we know to do it with a SQL shop, with a standard SQL shop, but it's also doable. So I will say that in all three options, you have the way to schedule a task and run it there.
Well, we still have more time to answer more questions. So if you are watching us right now, just leave a comment. There is a delay between what you're seeing live and what we're actually doing live. So if you can just share a question, that would be helpful for us to answer whenever we see the comments. So the next question is from the João too, but I guess it's
Mhm.
another João.
Mhm.
Uh, what is more important for Azure SQL database performance in high memory, high CPU, or high IOPs?
Well, the answer to that question is depends. Right? It's depend on the application, depends on the workload that you have. Uh, all three components are, let's say, the most important within SQL: CPU, memory, and disk. Right? But again, maybe your application is more CPU intensive than disk intensive, right? Or if you need to scale, maybe you need to add a faster disk than instead of adding CPU. Or maybe you are having a bottleneck in your CPU because your disks are slow, and it's not able to go through the whole activity, and that is why you have the bottleneck, right? So in my recommendation in this area is that what you should have, this doesn't matter if it is Azure SQL, Azure SQL DB, Managed Instance, or your SQL Server 2008 that you have on-premise, right? What you have to have in your toolbox, right, is what I call the baseline, right? You need to understand how is the normal behavior, the normal operation of your database environment on a normal day, on a normal, under normal circumstances, right? What is the average CPU usage? What is the average IOPS per second per disk, or the latency and these kind of things. So then if you are under stress with try to solving one problem, you just go to any of these metrics, any of this counter, and you compare it with your baseline, and very quickly you can understand, hey, I'm having a problem here because this number related to CPU usage is much higher than my baseline, right? So this is more, in terms of how you design or how you monitor your environment. I mean, the one that I always pay more attention in those three, CPU, memory, and disk, is disk, right? To me, is the first one that I go to check. But again, that is depending on the type of workload that you are using.
I like how you say it depends, because depends. There are so many different ways that we can do things today
Absolutely.
in different areas, that everything kind of
Yeah.
depends.
Yeah.
Uh, it's so funny. Like I come from the product
Uh-huh.
side, UX side, and depends. It's also like we also use a lot because so many different circumstances that make us to make some decisions.
Absolutely.
It's interesting.
Absolutely.
Um, so we're about to finish the event. I would like again to invite everyone to join the reactors. We have many different reactors around the globe. Maybe there is a reactor next to you. Who knows? If so, just look for Meetup Reactor and type a name of the city, or you can go to microsoftreactor.com, and then you can find the other reactors too. Uh, One last thing though, that I would like to say is that every event that we do, we ask you to fill or answer this survey, uh, so we can improve our events and make the experiences better. We can see what are your opinions about the content that we're sharing, and it is really important for us. Uh, Whenever you access this link, the very first question is about, it's going to be about the event code for this particular event. The code is 11724. Is the very first question at the top. And yeah, I guess this is it. Javier, thank you again for being here with us. I can see that you have your screen here with thank you. I will leave it there. Thank you for being with us twice, and let's make it. I need to learn Spanish so we can do this in Spanish too. All right. So thank you everybody for being here with us today. Thank you, Javier, again for being here with us today again, and see you next time. Bye. Bye, everybody.
Bye, Caio. Bye, everyone.